What up? It's your boy T-Bone Reaction. Today's Wrestling Reaction, Wrestling Wednesday or Wrestling Reaction. Depends on how many times I get this uploaded. So, I just got finished doing another episode of Oh My God, Wrestling Highlights. Which most of these highlights are feature indie wrestling. So, I said it because speaking of indie wrestling, but I take a look at this newest video from Wrestling and I've been reacting to a lot of this video. But this one I thought was really cool one to check. I call The Best Indies Wrestlers Ever. Indie wrestling, if you're not familiar with indie wrestling at all, indie wrestling is pretty much independent wrestling, and a lot of folks, indie wrestling is like one of the like alternative to the majors such as WWF and at the time TNA and even before that WCW as well too. Though it's for like a lot of folks who have an ambition of being a wrestler, goes through wrestling school. Sometimes some of the wrestling schools are their own independent production, independent promotions. They do indie shows. There are ones off as well too, and sometimes as well as not just people who have ambition wrestling, people who are either semi-retire or as well as been recently released as well too, and or somebody who's looking to rebrand themselves or let's say go take a chance on themselves as well too, bet on themselves as well too. Though we witnessed flights of Cody Rhodes, Macadona, Drew McIntyre as well too, and we see folks who got a start who are major stars right now. I mean, you got some who's got they start in the majors like The Rock and The Rock, Roman Reigns, John Cena, there. But those who got their start in the Indies who became majors such as Dan Bryan, Seth Rollins, John Moxley as well too, and the best in the world, CM Punk, as well as some ladies such as Becky Lynch, Paige, and Sasha Banks / Mercedes Moné, who also goes back to the Indies, they're belt collecting as well too. And even some of the notable major companies got started in as well too, such as ECW, who started as East Championship Wrestling as another their territory from NWA, as well as Ring of Honor, who's now became a major company. Got purchased by AEW as well too, and AEW became the major company for indie wrestlers as well too. Though, and then not to mention indie wrestlers getting a chance in the majors such as TNA, AEW, and especially WWE with the new ID program. Well, we're looking back at those who paved the way for indie wrestlers as well too, whether those that got a start as indies or those who wasn't a major then went on to bet themselves as well too. And you can say some of the early developmental or started indie before it got purchased by the likes of WWE, such as Evolve Wrestling, OVW was now independent again, Progress, as well as the international companies such as ICW and WXW and all that as well too, and not to mention GCW and CZW as well too. So anyway, let's take a look at some of who's considered the best indie wrestlers of all time. For those who became big stars in the majors, those who've been in the indie for long that they became just as legendary as the major players as well too. To when they make a one-off or be an honor, appearance in honor, they are just as value as a legend as well too. So without further ado, let's check out the best indie wrestlers ever. Let's get it.
After WCW and ECW both died within a couple of months of each other in early 2001, and consequently, WWE became the only major league, a thriving indie scene developed in the USA. And not just there. No, this would expand to places like Europe too. After all, Vince McMahon couldn't employ everyone, and there were certain performers who were never going to fit his bill. So that meant a lot of great talents would ply their crafts on the independents instead. Who were the best of these talents? Well, that's exactly what we are going to be looking at right now, starting with arguably the best of them all, Bryan Danielson. Yes, after first gaining notoriety on the scene after shining during that famous APW King of the Indies tournament in 2001, the show which served as the precursor for Ring of Honor, Bryan Danielson was able to have a hell of a career on the indie scene for the next few years. Seriously, This is a man who did it all, with him running the gambit of working the Butlins circuit in the UK, all the way to being the ace of the aforementioned Ring of Honor back when it was widely considered to be the best independent promotion on the planet. What were some of his highlights? Well, most of them came in ROH, with it being here that he developed his persona of the American Dragon, a technical maestro who liked nothing more than to tear his opponents apart piece by piece. And amongst the opponents he picked apart during his legendary run there as world champion were Kenta, Low-Ki, Takeshi Morishima, and of course, arguably his greatest career rival, Nigel McGuinness. Sure, it might have taken him a long time to get a
Nigel McGuinness is one of the ones I mentioned that, you know, did most of the stuff in the Indies, and although he did have a run TNA as Desmond Wolf though, but he's honored as one of the major players just as much as the ones who made it in the major rules as well too.
Serious look in from WWE on account of him not being physically what the company was looking for, but Danielson didn't seem to care about this, as all he wanted to do was wrestle, whether it brought him fame and fortune or not. Seriously, this is a man who has gone on record as saying if he had been paid just a little bit more in order to cover his bills, he'd have never left the Butlins circuit. As we all know now, though, somehow he would end up in the big leagues and actually thrive there in a way few others ever have. That's right, once the American Dragon made it to WWE in 2010, it would only be a few years before he became so undeniable that Vince McMahon was left with no choice but to give him the world title in the main event of WrestleMania 30. What happened after that? Well, Bryan would remain in WWE all the way up until 2021, at which point he jumped over to AEW to run out his career with arguably the best work he'd ever put out. That said, none of this would have ever happened had he not first been given a platform on the indies. And Bryan Danielson isn't the only wrestler who used the independent circuit as a great place to hone his craft during the 2000s. No, the exact same thing could be said about our next subject too, Samoa Joe. Okay, we know we just made the argument that Bryan Danielson might very well have been the best wrestler in the world during the 2000s, but there's also an argument which could be made for Samoa Joe here too. And that's because, after also first breaking out during that APW King of the Indies tournament in 2001, he'd absolutely shine everywhere he went. Sure, we know a significant portion of his run here was spent in TNA, which, given it was on TV, technically means it's not an indie, but even more so than the Impact Zone.
You said that, I forgot to mention the guy who was officially supposed to retire because of that damn Gunther, AJ Styles as well too.
There's an argument to be made that Joe's real home back then was Ring of Honor. After all, it was in Ring of Honor that he held the world title for a whopping 645 days, in the process helping to put the promotion on the map with some of the best.
Hold on a second. I'm bad. Let's keep going.
Best bouts of the era. Seriously, it didn't matter who the Samoan submission machine went up against here. Bryan Danielson, Christopher Daniels, Low-Ki, they all had to bring their A game whenever they stepped in the ring with the champ. And that in-ring skill which Joe possessed was on even clearer display during his now iconic feud against CM Punk. A feud which was so good, it would become a regular fixture for fans to pass around on the early tape trading circuit. Perhaps even more so than his feud against Punk, though, or his lengthy ROH world title reign, what Samoa Joe's time on the indies is most remembered for today is that famous match he had against All Japan Pro Wrestling legend Kenta Kobashi at a Ring of Honor show in October of 2005, fittingly titled Joe vs. Kobashi. This match, a one-time affair, has since gone on to enter the realm of myth for 2000s indie wrestling fans, with many to this day still considering it to be one of the greatest bouts of all time. All of this is to say, then, Samoa Joe was synonymous with the US indie circuit here in a way which most others could never be. But what of the third part of that early ROH triad we've yet to fully talk about? Well, he's the person we're going to be talking about next, as it happens. The man who goes by the name of CM Punk. Now, what made CM Punk so popular in Ring of Honor, and to a lesser extent IWA Mid-South during the 2000s, was less his wrestling ability and more the way he crafted such an engaging character. Sure, he was a great wrestler in his own right, but he was never quite on the level of a Bryan Danielson or a Samoa Joe when it came to this area of the job. What Phil Brooks had to make up for this, though, was his promo skills. Skills so strong they would be able to turn him into the hottest thing on the whole scene after a while. Yes, there was a period where, if you knew one thing about US indie wrestling, it was probably CM Punk. Such a force of nature was he with his holier-than-thou straight-edge character and his Jim Jones-esque ability to create a cult of personality around himself. Hell, It was
the
this
personality.
character, combined with his great in-ring work, which saw him draw fans in for his classic series with the Samoan Submission Machine in ROH, or his famous bout against Eddie Guerrero in IWA Mid-South.
Yeah.
And it was also these factors which saw him become Ring of Honor World Champion for a brief period in the summer of 2005, a period which would be destined to go down in history as the first Summer of Punk. What happened here? Well, not long after winning the gold, Punk would officially sign on the dotted line with WWE, with him going as far as to literally sign his contract on top of the belt itself. And once that happened, it created a situation where he was threatening to abscond to the big leagues with the title in tow.
He tried it then.
Over the weeks which followed, a very memorable angle played itself out in which everyone in ROH would be trying to beat Punk before he could run off with their top prize.
Wow, so he pretty much did what he did with the WWE belt, we know the some Punk was there with this. Wow, that's interesting right there.
Which was eventually done by James Gibson, aka Jamie Noble. That's right, it was this angle which many remember CM Punk's indie run for today. But then why wouldn't it be? Because it only further showed his ability to create an engaging story, something which would be very important for him during his subsequent run in WWE, the very place he redid the Summer of Punk in 2011. What were the indies doing by then? Well, they'd have moved on to another generation of stars, one of the most prominent of which was our next subject, a man who famously had no love for Brooks, Kevin Steen. Sure, he might best be known today as Kevin Owens, but before he joined WWE in 2014, Steen was known for being one of the secret weapons of the North American indie circuit. How did he do this? Well, by not only being an excellent in-ring worker, but like with CM Punk, also being a master of the mic. Honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better talker than this Quebec native back in the late 2000s and early 2010s. So captivating was he every time he picked up the stick.
Well, it's 5-on-5, it's Feisteen fight.
This made him a hit everywhere he went, whether that be in Combat Zone Wrestling, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, or of course, Ring of Honor. Hell, Steen would end up winning gold in each of these three promotions. And in the latter two, one of the belts he'd hold would be the world title, with this proving that to audiences watching back then, he was the guy. That said, it wouldn't be all about winning belts for the Canadian during this run on the Indies. No, it would also be about the memorable storylines. Storylines like his famous Austin versus McMahon-esque program with Jim Cornette in Ring of Honor. And then, of course, there was his...
so you kind of had that before, too. That little fighting story, too. He did the same thing with, Shane McMahon as a face.
His lengthy on and off again friendship with El Generico, the man who at different points was Steen's best friend and greatest enemy. The story these two men told across various different companies during the late 2000s and early 2010s is so well known to indie wrestling fans from that era, it's one of the main things which got him signed to WWE in the first place. Basically, what we're saying here is that during this second generation of the US indie boom, there were few people who were operating at a higher level than Kevin Steen. But what of that great frenemy of his we just mentioned? Well, he's our next subject, as he was also a key figure on the scene here in his own right. So with that said, let's move on to El Generico next. Now, if you're a modern-day WWE fan, then you'll no doubt be aware of who Sami Zayn is, beloved babyface and the man arguably most responsible for the promotion's increased wave of popularity during the early to mid-2020s. What you might not know, though, if you've only started watching recently, is that Zayn had a famous mentor who taught him everything he knew about the ways of the ring, a mentor who went by the name of El Generico. Yes, we've all heard the rumors that Sami and Generico are actually one and the same, but you and we all know that these rumors are completely baseless. No, the truth is the masked Canadian luchador was a different person entirely. That said, it is true that like with Sami Zayn, he also shared a close friendship with Kevin Steen, with it being this which led to both of these men partnering up a lot in places like PWG and ROH back in the day. And so successful would they be when they did this, they'd become tag team champions in each promotion. Of course, as we mentioned in our entry on Steen, they'd also feud just as much as they partnered up, with this creating a very volatile dynamic between the two, which always got fans engaged whenever they were in the ring together. What else made El Generico's time on the Indies stand out so much back in the late 2000s and early 2010s? Well, aside from his work in Ring of Honor and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, there was also his output in more comedic companies like Chikara and DDT. That's right, while he could always be counted on to go in the ring to a very high level, the real secret weapon of this mystery figure was his ability to entertain audiences by bringing the laughs. Sadly, though, after disappearing in 2013,
Here we go.
nothing has been heard of Generico again. No,
Sure.
today his legacy is being carried on by the man he trained
Yup.
before he mysteriously vanished, Sami
Sami
Zayn.
Zayn.
But let's move away from missing figures for now and over to very visible ones instead. A duo this time. So visible are these two, they've actually leveraged their star power on the indies to create a second major league in recent years. That's right,
The Young
it's
Bucks.
time for us to talk.
And also, I meant to kind of mention, 'cause I had this all planned out, that, you know, a lot of your wrestler, a lot of wrestlers that are in the majors has caused most of these independent darlings as well too that became legendary as your favorite wrestler, or your favorite tag team. But yeah, these two definitely became the best tag teams, one of the best tag team of the indie scenes as well too.
About the Young Bucks. Now, while you could argue about who the best in-ring wrestlers from the US indie scene of the 2000s and 2010s are, there's less of an argument to be made about who the most important figures from this period are. After all, in Matt and Nick Jackson, you have a pair of brothers who forever changed the industry in a major way. How did they manage to do so? Well, by first building up a very big name for themselves as arguably the best tag team on the planet throughout the latter decade, with their work in places such as Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Ring of Honor, Chikara, and Dragon's Gate. So successful would they be in these places, in fact, pretty soon they'd have developed a major cult following. A cult following which only got stronger once they arrived in New Japan Pro Wrestling,
Yup.
and there became a key part of the Bullet Club. You see, more than just being great wrestlers, what the Bucks have always been are very savvy businessmen, and this savviness allowed them to create a brand which would make them more money on the indies than they ever would have in WWE. Seriously, by the time the mid to late 2010s had arrived, the Elite, the trio made up of Matt, Nick, and their close friend Kenny Omega, would be one of the most talked about things in wrestling. Hell, so talked about would they would eventually be a major part of the reason All In happened in September of 2018, the biggest indie wrestling show of all time. And we all know what came out of All In,
Yup.
All Elite Wrestling, the first real competitor to WWE in almost 2 decades. Without the Bucks, AEW quite simply doesn't happen. So for that reason alone, they have to be considered one of the most important indie acts in the industry's lengthy history. Really, what they helped to create with AEW was a spiritual continuation of that 2000s and 2010s indie scene, as so many of the people who first made their name there would end up working down in Jacksonville.
Yep.
But they weren't the only tag team of this era who made a major name for themselves on the indies. No, there was another who made almost as big of an impact, a team who went by the name of
Briscoes.
the Briscoe Brothers.
RPJ.
Reach for the
Jay.
sky, boy. Whenever
My boys from my second home, Delaware.
you heard those words over the sound system at a Ring of Honor show back in the 2000s or 2010s, you knew business was about to pick up, because it meant the duo of brothers Jay and Mark Briscoe were about to enter the fray. And if you were a long-term fan of ROH, these were two people you'd have been very familiar with. Why was that? Well, because they were literally there from day one,
Yup.
with them being so young at that first show that Jay wasn't even allowed to get in the ring and actually wrestle. Obviously, though, as time went on, that changed, and both
You mean Mark? Because Jay's older. Jay is older. But anyway, and that's another thing. And good thing you pointed out too is another thing. The mission is about that too. That the advantage of a lot of indie wrestling it can do is, you know, most of the maybe promotion you gotta be at least 18 to wrestle, and as well too. But a lot of people will get they start before 18 as well too. Indies major in the indies as well too. So that's another little advantage right there. But it's still gotta be of age. But yeah.
Briscoe brothers became a key part of the promotion, so much so that over the course of the next 2 decades, they'd win their tag team titles a total of 13 times. And it wasn't just Ring of Honor that Jay and Mark were plying their craft in here either. No, they'd also be going around the circuit and becoming highlights of places like Combat Zone Wrestling and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla. Hell, at one point, they'd even venture out to Japan to work for New Japan Pro Wrestling, with them there becoming IWGP Tag Team Champions as well. All of this is to say then that, with the possible exception of the Young Bucks, there was no more dominating duo throughout the 2000s and 2010s than the Briscoes. And they weren't limited to tag team action either. Why do we say that? Well, because there were points where they'd go solo too, and in the process would find a lot of success, enough to where Jay would become a multiple-time ROH World Champion. Sadly though, when AEW started in 2019, these Delaware natives would not be able to make the jump there on account of their signings being vetoed by a Warner Brothers executive once past homophobic tweets of Jay's came to light. So because of that then, they'd remain a pillar of the Ring of Honor roster into the 2020s, all the way up until Tony Khan bought it in early 2022. And when Jay Briscoe tragically passed away not long after this, Mark would officially be signed with All Elite Wrestling, where he continued to appear in the smaller company. Seriously, despite being able to show up on Dynamite and Collision, there was a period there where Mark Briscoe seemed to have such loyalty to ROH, he'd primarily wrestle there, with this allowing him to also win that brand's world title, just as his brother had done years prior. Unfortunately, though, not everyone who was a standout of Ring of Honor would make their way over to AEW. No, there were some for whom this was never an option, and if you need an example of this being the case, you need look no further than our next subject, Low Ki. Now, while most, if not all, of the people that we're looking at today will be familiar to newer fans on account of the fact that they eventually went on to work for either WWE or AEW, Low Ki does not fall into that category. No, despite getting a brief run in WWE during the early 2010s, where he worked under the name of Kaval, this proved to be so short, it never had any time to make a real impact. And the reason it was so short was the same reason that the Brooklyn native never joined a lot of his fellow ROH originals in All Elite Wrestling. He's so notoriously difficult to work with, he makes 90s Shawn Michaels seem like a sweetheart. That said, none of this can take away from how important he was to the US indie scene during the 2000s when, while Bryan Danielson, Samoa Joe, and CM Punk were all tearing it up, Low Ki was right there alongside them. Hell, his style was so eye-catching here, some actually preferred him to those three. What did this style entail? Well, a lot of stiff strikes, many of which were just shoot strikes if we're being honest. What this did though was give his matches an air of genuine danger, which couldn't be replicated by anyone else in the scene. Come on now, there's a reason why when Ring of Honor had to pick someone to crown as their inaugural world champion in 2002, they chose Brandon Silvestri. And there's a reason why he continued to be a key part of that promotion for years to come, just as he would also be an important part of places like TNA and Pro Wrestling Guerrilla for a while. Basically, even if he was a loose cannon in the most volatile sense of the word, even if he would eventually alienate pretty much everyone around him, he was just so good and so unique that promoters still wanted to use him back in the days when the indie boom was just starting out. Could he have been more? Absolutely. Hell, if his attitude had been even a little better, there's no reason Low Ki couldn't have had a career as successful as someone like Samoa Joe. And he's not the only performer from this time period who never reached his full potential because, for entirely different reasons, there would be another ROH original who stumbled before he could reach the big leagues. Who are we talking about here? Why, someone who it could be argued was the fourth pillar of Ring of Honor alongside Joe, Danielson, and Punk, London's own Nigel McGuinness. Yes, if you were a fan of ROH during those early years, then you'll no doubt have been a fan of Nigel McGuinness, as he was quite simply one of the best performers on the roster. And when you consider some of the people who were on that roster, many of whom we've talked about already today, that's saying quite a lot. What did he do to stand out? Well, have some of the best matches in the company for one. Come on now, who can forget that legendary series he had with Bryan Danielson, a series which is still talked about fondly to this day. And all this would lead to a situation where, by the time his run there was over, Nigel would be a one-time ROH Pure Champion and a one-time ROH World Champion. Sadly though, that would not be enough to see him end up in the big leagues like his friend and rival Bryan Danielson. Why was that? Well, as was documented in the heartbreaking The Last of McGuinness documentary, the Englishman would see his contract offer from WWE be revoked after he was unable to get himself cleared to wrestle in time. So because of that then, following a brief run in TNA, his career would come to an untimely end soon thereafter. Of course, there would eventually be a happy ending, however, because over a decade later, Nigel would sign on the dotted line with AEW initially as a commentator. And as time went on in Jacksonville, he'd be able to return to the ring once more, with this allowing him not only to perform at Wembley Stadium in the summer of 2024, but also to have one last match with the American Dragon just 1 month later at Arthur Ashe Stadium in New York City. And Nigel McGuinness isn't the only indie legend who got a chance to have his last stand in AEW during the 2020s. No, the same thing could be said about our next subject too, Christopher Daniels. Now we know Christopher Daniels is probably most commonly associated with his time in TNA, and with that company being on television, it can't really be considered an indie. That said, this was far from all the Fallen Angel was doing during the 2000s and 2010s. No, outside of that, he was continuing to work all around the circuit, helping to elevate the scene on every show he was on by being another contender for Best Wrestler in the World during this time period. Hell, in particular, his work in Ring of Honor stands out, as it was there that, all while he was regularly tearing the house down from bell to bell, he was winning numerous championships, including the ROH six-man tag titles, the tag team titles, the television title, and the world title. Seriously, over the course of his 3 runs in that company between 2002 and 2019, there was never a point when Daniels wasn't one of the best on the roster. And that was exactly why, when AEW formed in the latter year then, he'd be an easy choice to be a day one member. Of course, by this point, though, the fact that he was in his late 40s meant the Fallen Angel would play the role of player-coach here, with this allowing him to impart the years of wisdom he'd learned on the indie circuit to the next generation of wrestlers. What a gift this was for the AEW roster, then, to have someone as talented as Christopher Daniels, a true king of the indies, there to pick the brain of. And Daniels isn't the only king of the indies who currently has a backstage role in Tony Khan's promotion. No, that's also a statement which applies to our next subject, Chris Hero. Chris Hero. There's a reason he's a guy who for years had the moniker of the wrestling genius. And that's because as far as experts of the craft go, he's right up there with the best of them. Seriously, such an encyclopedic knowledge does this guy have of the industry, such a savant-like understanding does he have of how to perform in the ring. It was probably always a given that he was going to be a huge success on the indie scene when he started working there in the early 2000s. Where would he set up shop at this point? Well, like with many of the independents, Hero would not stick to one place. Rather, he'd move around from promotion to promotion as and when he pleased. And it was this which saw him work not just for the mighty Ring of Honor, but also Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, Combat Zone Wrestling, and Chikara, just to name a few, with it being in each of these companies that he was able to wow audiences with his technical prowess. Sure, he might never have gotten that big run in WWE, but that didn't make him any less of a talent deserving of being paid attention to during the 2000s and 2010s. And it's not like he didn't work for Vince McMahon at all, as he did serve a spell in NXT for a while under the name of Cassius Ohno, with this allowing him to collect a nice paycheck for a few years. After that run was over, though, it was back to his old stomping ground of the indie circuit where Hero, now getting a little older, continued to prove why he was a man deserving of being a one-time PWG World Champion, one-time Evolve Champion, one-time CZW World Champion, and 4-time IWA Mid-South Heavyweight Champion. And because so many of the people he worked with here would eventually end up in AEW, it gave the Dayton native an in to start working there in 2023 as a backstage coach.
Nice.
But we've talked about a couple of people now who have a claim to the moniker of King of the Indies without talking about the man who's used that title as a gimmick for so long. The man who ruled the roost on the circuit throughout the 2020s. So let's talk about him now then, the one, the only, Matt Cardona. That's right, while the people we've looked at so far today are all people who came up on the 2000s and 2010s independent scene, Matt Cardona was spending that period working for WWE. Really then, given he started out in the big leagues, it should have been easy for him to fail once he was cut by Vince McMahon in 2020, and from there forced to venture out on his own for the first time. But in the end, the former Long Island Ice Z was able to use this to his advantage because when he subsequently arrived in places like Game Changer Wrestling, Major League Wrestling, and Billy Corgan's National Wrestling Alliance, he'd be playing the character of a WWE performer dropped right into enemy territory. What a great move this was then, because in playing the role of a guy working the WWE style here who wanted to fix the independents, he was able to get over as a massive heel, at least at first. And we say at first because eventually the King of the Indies would start to get over with that audience on account of his commitment to the bit and his desire to truly elevate the scene. Would this lead to any title success for him? Why, yes. In fact, there was a point where Cardona was winning belts almost everywhere he went, with some of the prizes he snagged here being the DDT Universal Championship, the House of Glory Heavyweight Championship, the Juggalo Championship Wrestling Heavyweight Championship, the GCW Heavyweight Championship, and even the NWA World's Championship. All of this is to say then, if there was one man who was defining the US indie scene during the 2020s, it was Matt Cardona. Yes, he was to this decade what names like CM Punk, Kevin Steen, and others were to prior ones. As things stand right now, however, it looks like the New Yorker's run in the minors has come to an end as he's recently re-signed with WWE. Thankfully, though, one thing we've learned over time is that there will always be a host of new up-and-coming talent ready to take his place, and we're talking about names like Adam Priest, LeBron Cazone, Ali Catch, and many others here, and who knows? Maybe one day, if they're lucky, some of those people will also be able to stand up alongside those we've looked at today as the best independent wrestlers.
Yeah, definitely some good picks as well too for the best people to be known as the best Indies wrestlers as well though. So other than that though, this was a good video from Wrestling with Andy. Other than that, if you like my reaction, like, share, subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's your boy T signing off. One love.